Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the hold music of the abyss, the echo of the unspoken word, the premature echo, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The hold music of the abyss. It is perfectly still now, and we are finally alone in the pressurized silence. The heavy metal door to the storage locker sits slightly ajar, but nothing moves within it anymore. My daughter, Alara, is curled into my side, her breathing rhythmic and steady as she drifts into a deep sleep. We have reached our destination, the end of the waiting. Just moments ago, Alara whispered that the visitor had stopped moving entirely, its hum fading into the background of the hull's low groan. I took her hand and squeezed it, feeling the warmth of her skin against the cold metal of the submersible's bench. Before that, she had been trembling, watching the locker with wide eyes as the entity began to pull itself out completely. It was no longer a suggestion or a shadow. It was a physical presence, draped over our chairs like a heavy velvet curtain made of sound. The air smelled faintly of ozone and old violins, a dry, dusty scent that shouldn't have existed in the damp humidity of the deep ocean. Alara gasped when she realized its face was finally facing her, showing us all the loops it had gathered from the centuries of human patience. It looked at us with 3 pupils in each eye, arranged like a triangle, glowing with a soft, amber light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Then came the moment of peak tension, where the entity stood upright for the first time since we descended. It was a towering thing of woven copper wires and shimmering silk ribbons that vibrated with every breath it took. It didn't have a solid body so much as a collection of textures, smooth brass plates, frayed threads of velvet, and hundreds of tiny, ticking gears embedded in its chest. When it first moved, it did so with a series of wet clicks, pulling its many-jointed limbs from the darkness of the closet. It didn't walk, it glided, the ribbons on its head swaying like seaweed in an underwater current. But before that movement, there was the realization. Alara pointed her small finger at the door and said, "It's awake now." She spoke with a certainty that chilled my marrow, because for hours, the closet had been occupied by something we couldn't see, only hear. We heard the muffled symphony of every elevator ride, every telephone queue, and every waiting room in human history playing simultaneously inside that small box. It was a chaotic, overlapping melody of flutes, pizzicato strings, and low, humming cellos. The entity was gathering its strength, distilling our patience into a physical form. I remember the first time we felt it. We were 3,000 meters down, stranded on the seafloor with failing batteries and a ticking clock. At first, it was just a faint vibration in the floorboards, a tiny ping of a piano key hitting a note. Then came the rhythmic pulse. It began to seep out from the closet like smoke, a ghostly melody that seemed to have its own weight. We were terrified because we didn't know what lived in there, only that it had been waiting for the silence of the deep sea to claim it. As the hours bled into one another, the music became more complex. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical pressure against our eardrums. The notes seemed to have colors, deep indigo cellos and bright gold trumpets. I watched Alara as she sat perfectly still, her ears straining against the hull. She looked less like a child and more like a statue of concentration, her small face illuminated by the flickering amber glow that began to leak from the cracks of the locker door. The submersible felt smaller then, as if the music was carving out space inside the room, pushing back the walls until we were cocooned in a sphere of vibration. There was a moment when the sound reached a fever pitch, a frantic, beautiful cacophony of every human who had ever waited for something to happen. A doctor's office, a train station, a dial tone, a lullaby. The entity was coalescing, pulling the disparate threads of time into a single, unified being. I felt my own heart sink with its rhythm, a steady thrumming that made my bones ache with a strange, melodic resonance. We were caught in the transition between the known and the unknown, suspended in the dark water while our silent companion prepared to introduce itself to the world. The echo of the unspoken word. Welcome to your first shift at the Blackwood Schoolhouse. It's a modest, one-room structure sitting off the gravel road, currently devoid of students, but teeming with history. You will find it quiet, mostly. That is what most people say before they hear the echo. I want you to listen closely to my instructions before you step inside for your first hour alone. The schoolhouse was built in 1884, and while the wood has settled into a permanent groan, there is one specific sound you must monitor. It begins with the click. You will know it when you hear it, the distinct, metallic snap of a door being latched shut. However, here is the catch. You will be standing in the center of the room with every single door and window already bolted tight. When that click happens, it means something has just moved behind you. The entity is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It is a weaver of sound. It doesn't have a face so much as a texture. Imagine a creature made of overlapping, velvet-soft scales, each one the color of bruised plums and antique copper. It has no nose, but a wide, lipless mouth that stretches horizontally across its head like a grin. It moves with a heavy, rhythmic thrumming, its body undulating like a deep-sea jellyfish gliding through thick syrup. Most importantly, it speaks in your own voice, but it only chooses the words you were thinking but failed to say. On your first night, you will enter and find the room smelling of old chalk and damp timber. You will sit at the heavy oak desk and begin your inventory. For a long time, there will be nothing but the sound of your own breathing. Then it will happen. The click will resonate from the far corner of the ceiling. You will turn, seeing nothing but dust motes dancing in your lantern light. Then comes the first echo. It won't be a repetition of what you just spoke. It will be the word you were holding back. If you were thinking lonely, the air will vibrate with your own voice whispering lonely from the rafters. You will feel a slight draft, as if something heavy had brushed past your shoulder. Do not jump. The creature is merely tasting your thoughts. As the hour progresses, the echoes will become more frequent and more deliberate. You might think cold, and the room will reply cold from beneath the floorboards. You might think hidden, and the voice will hiss, hidden from directly behind your left ear. The creature is closing in. It doesn't walk. It ripples toward you, its velvet scales rubbing together to produce a sound like silk being torn. By the time the clock strikes midnight, the echoes will stop being singular words. They will become sentences. You will think, "Is it here?" And the room will answer, "It is already touching your hair." You will feel the weight of its presence, a heavy, humid pressure against your back. It doesn't have eyes to see you with, but it feels the vibration of your internal monologue. The most unsettling part occurs when the creature finally decides to manifest fully in your line of sight. It won't be a sudden jump scare. Instead, it will slowly unfold from the shadows of the rafters, its plum-colored scales shimmering. It will hang there, suspended by a thick, muscular tail that coils like a vine. Its lipless mouth will open wide, revealing rows of flat, square teeth. It will wait for you to think the final word of your shift, the word that signifies your fear of the unknown. You will look at it, and its velvet body will pulse with a soft, rhythmic light. It will lean down, its weight causing the floorboards to sag, and its mouth will move. You will think, "Please," and the creature will exhale the word perfectly into your mind, not as a sound in the air, but as a sensation in your skull. The click will happen one last time, this time from the door you entered through. You will realize that while you were watching it, it was also measuring the distance between its skin and yours. The creature will pull back slightly, its scales settling into a peaceful rest. You can leave now. You have finished your inventory. But as you reach for the handle of the door to exit, you will feel a cold, wet sensation on the top of your head. You didn't think the word wet, but the creature did. The Premature Echo, redacted, was the primary subject of Incident 402-B. The subject moved into a narrow, rectangular spare room located at the rear of a Victorian estate. Unlike the rest of the house, which was curated and clean, this room was a chaotic graveyard of the previous owner's life. It was stacked floor to ceiling with cardboard boxes, some bursting at the seams with yellowed newspapers, heavy wool coats, and porcelain trinkets. Redacted spent the first 3 days simply navigating the labyrinth of crates. However, on the fourth night, the room began to behave strangely. It started with a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, as if something were tapping a fingernail against wood. Then came the voice. Redacted stood in the center of the room and spoke aloud. "Is anyone here?" The silence that followed felt heavy. But then, before the vibration of the first word could even fade, a response came from the corner where the boxes piled highest. "Here," the voice replied. It wasn't an immediate echo. It was a voice that arrived just a fraction of a second before the sound finished leaving Redacted's mouth. It was deeper than their own, textured like velvet rubbed against gravel. The next day, the sensation intensified. Redacted began to notice a peculiar hunger, not for food, but for things they had never desired before. They found themselves staring at a dented tin cup in a box and feeling a sudden, overwhelming ache to possess it. Then, they wanted a specific piece of lint on the floor. Then, they craved the smell of a moth-eaten rug. It was an appetite for the mundane, yet profound. The entity, a creature residing within the boxes, seemed to be tasting Redacted's desires. Every time Redacted looked at an object, the entity would claim it first. They would see a brass key and think, "I want that," only for the key to vanish from the box a heartbeat before they could fully commit to the thought. The entity was stealing their intent. By the sixth night, the physical presence of the entity became visible. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a shimmering, translucent mass of iridescent scales and soft, moss-like fuzz. It had 3 bulbous ears that vibrated like tuning forks and a mouth filled with rows of tiny, square teeth. It didn't have a face so much as a collection of features. It sat atop a box of old books, its body pulsing with a dim, amber light. Redacted realized the entity was eating their wants. As they watched, the creature reached out with a limb that looked like a twisted piece of driftwood covered in silk. It touched a stack of letters. Before Redacted could think of wanting to read them, the creature inhaled, and the letters turned into fine white ash. The appetite was growing. The entity began to crave larger things. It started eating Redacted's memories of color, then their memories of warmth. One evening, Redacted felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing for the feeling of blue. Almost instantly, the creature lunged forward, its 3 ears ringing with a high-pitched hum. They watched as the entity swallowed the concept of blue from their mind, leaving the room suddenly washed in a flat, neutral hue. The most terrifying shift occurred on the 10th night. Redacted stopped trying to choose what they wanted. They realized that if they thought of something, it was gone. To avoid losing their desires, they tried to keep their minds as still as possible. But even then, the entity was hungry. It began to feed on the wants they hadn't even formed yet, the potential desires. The room grew quieter. The boxes started to shrink as the creature consumed the very essence of the objects within them. Finally, Redacted felt a deep, hollow yearning for their own name. They opened their mouth to think it, but the entity was already there. It hovered inches from their face, its mossy fur glowing brightly. It opened its square-toothed mouth and inhaled the sound of Redacted's identity. The room fell into a profound silence. Redacted looked at their hands, then at the creature, which now looked full and satisfied, its scales shimmering with a new, stolen luster. They were still there, but they were no longer someone. They were simply an observer of the hunger. Then, the entity pulsed once more, its velvet gravel voice vibrating against Redacted's very thoughts before the thought could even form. It spoke into the void of their mind, a preemptive answer to a question not yet asked, "Here." And in that instant, Redacted realized they were no longer the one asking. They were the thing being consumed by the echo. The key bearer of the canal. Sit closer, little one. Pull that blanket up to your chin, because even though we are safe inside these walls, you must understand what waited for me in the mist. My grandfather was a lockkeeper on the Great Canal, living in a cottage where the water moved so slowly it seemed to breathe. It was a place of perpetual grayness and heavy silence. The fog there wasn't just weather. It was a heavy, wet wool that swallowed sound before it could travel far. It would wrap around your shoulders like a damp cloak, muffling the world until you could barely hear your own pulse or the rhythmic lapping of the water against the stone banks. One Tuesday, when the mist was particularly thick, the kind of fog that feels as though it has weight and substance, I stepped out onto the stone path to check the iron gates. The air tasted of wet moss and old minerals. The ground was damp with dew, a perfect canvas for catching every mark of my boots. I took a single step forward into the gray void. Then, from the fog ahead, another footprint appeared. It wasn't mine. It was slightly deeper, more deliberate, as if something heavy had pressed into the mud just moments before I arrived. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. The silence of the canal felt suddenly expectant. I took another step. A second later, a new print pressed into the mud 3 feet in front of me. It was perfectly shaped, yet there was no one there to see it. It felt as though someone were walking with me, mimicking my pace, staying just out of sight, carving its path into the earth before I could reach it. My pulse began to quicken, a steady thrumming against my ribs that seemed to echo in the hollow spaces of the fog. I began to walk faster, my boots crunching softly on the grit. For every stride I took, a matching mark appeared ahead with uncanny precision, as if an invisible twin were mirroring my movement. The further I walked, the more the atmosphere shifted from peaceful to peculiar. Then, the silence was broken by a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up, a tiny, metallic clinking. It wasn't a heavy thud or a sharp crack. It was delicate and rhythmic, sounding like dozens of small teeth tapping against one another in a constant, shimmering dance. Then, the fog parted just enough to reveal him. He wasn't a man of flesh and bone, but a creature assembled from hundreds of mismatched house keys. His head was a heavy brass skeleton key, his torso a dense cluster of silver gates keys, and his limbs were made of rusted iron ringlets that swayed with every movement. He didn't have a face in the way we do, but a central copper key served as a nose, and a large, ornate master key functioned as an eye that seemed to watch everything with a steady, unblinking gaze. He moved with a rhythmic jingle, his body swaying like a pendulum, each joint producing a different note of metal on metal. Every time he stepped, he left a footprint that looked exactly like mine, yet different in texture, smooth instead of rough. It was as if he were trying to perfect my stride. I realized then that he wasn't just walking. He was searching with an intense, quiet purpose. He was looking for the one thing he lacked, the perfect lock to fit his own heart. As we drew closer, the spatial gap between us began to shrink. The footprints were no longer 3 feet ahead. They were 2 feet away, then 1 foot. He was gaining on me, closing the distance with a steady, mechanical grace. I tried to run, my lungs burning slightly in the damp air, but for every frantic step I took, a second later, asterisk, clink asterisk, his keys rattled as he landed exactly where my heel had been a moment before. He was capturing my path, erasing the space between us. The fog seemed to thicken with every jingle of his body, turning into a swirling vortex of gray and silver. I could hear the frantic music of his metal limbs getting louder, the clinking becoming a chorus. The sense of being watched intensified until it felt as though the very air was pressing against my skin. I reached the cottage door and threw it open, diving inside just as the last set of footprints appeared at my heels. I slammed the heavy oak door shut and turned the iron bolt with a sharp thwack. I stood there in the dark, gasping for air, listening to the silence of the room return. Then, from the other side of the wood, came a soft, melodic chime. He had reached the door. And then, from the tiny crack beneath the frame, a single silver key poked through, turning slowly as if searching for a hole that hadn't been carved yet. The silent tenant of Peak 402. Welcome to the pinnacle of solitude. Perched atop the jagged spine of Mount Viridian sits a masterpiece of architectural isolation, the listening post. This real estate gem offers unparalleled panoramic views, a hearth that never cools, and walls thick enough to turn the howling gale into a rhythmic lullaby. It is a sanctuary for the seeker of silence, a fortress where the world falls away, leaving only you and the vast, white velvet of the snow. Every room in this structure is a triumph of design. The gallery is bathed in amber light, the kitchenette hums with efficiency, and the loft provides a cozy nest for contemplation. It is a home that breathes with elegance. However, there is one small caveat to the listing: the cellar. While every other room invites your presence, the cellar demands your awareness. For 3 months, I have lived here as the primary listener, capturing the static of the cosmos and the whispers of distant radio waves. At first, the solitude was a luxury. But as the blizzard deepened, the silence began to feel heavy, as if it were being gathered into a vessel. It started with the handwriting. Every morning, I sat at the mahogany desk in the main hall and wrote a single sentence in my journal. On day 1, the words were neat, my own steady script. The snow falls in rhythmic pulses. By day 4, the next entry was slightly different. The letters were still mine, but they leaned just a fraction of a degree to the right, as if a phantom hand had nudged them. By week 2, the shift became undeniable. My handwriting was beginning to drift, migrating across the page like a boat caught in a current. I found myself wondering who, or what was adjusting my thoughts while I slept. Then came the first day of the true anomaly. I woke to find that the words had moved so far from the center of the line that they were almost touching the margin. It was as if something had been walking along the page, dragging my letters with it. That was the night I realized I wasn't alone in the cellar. The entity is a person-shaped quiet. It doesn't have a face in the traditional sense. It has a surface of textured, velvet moss that ripples when it moves. It lacks bones, appearing more like a teardrop of heavy silk suspended in the air. It doesn't walk so much as it flows, and its primary hunger is for sound. When it sits near you, your voice becomes muffled, your breathing turns into a soft hum, and even the ticking of your watch seems to lose its bite. It drinks every noise within arm's reach, swallowing the vibrations until only a hollow resonance remains. For the first week, I didn't see it. I only felt the theft of my sounds. My shouts were cut short, their edges blunted as if they hit a wall of invisible cotton. Then, on day 21, I saw it standing in the corner of the hall. It was draped in a coat of deep indigo velvet, its body shimmering with a subtle, pearlescent sheen. When it moved closer to me, my heartbeat grew quiet, the thumping in my chest dampened into a rhythmic pulse that barely reached my ears. The handwriting changed again. My morning entry, "The silence is heavy today," was nearly at the very edge of the paper, pushed outward by the entity's proximity. It was moving closer to the desk every night, claiming more territory. I began to notice its peculiar physical habits. It doesn't just sit, it leans into the sounds it craves. When I spoke, it would stretch toward my mouth like a soft weight reaching for a falling fruit. Its body would ripple, the indigo velvet folding over itself in concentric circles as it inhaled the vowels. Each night, I felt the distance between my hand and its reach narrowing. It was drinking the atmosphere of the house. The crackle of the fire became a mere whisper. The whistle of the wind outside sounded like a distant sigh. By the end of the month, I stopped trying to speak aloud entirely because every word felt lonely as it left my lips, devoured by that person-shaped void before it could reach the walls. One morning, I opened my journal to find that the handwriting had drifted so far right that it was practically falling off the page. The entity was standing directly over my shoulder, its velvet body nearly touching my ear. It wasn't just drinking the sounds anymore. It was waiting for the ultimate silence. I sat perfectly still as it leaned in, its mossy surface vibrating with anticipation. I realized then that it wasn't just a guest in this house. It was an appetite. As I closed my eyes, I felt it draw in one final, desperate breath, pulling the very sound of my own thought into its velvet core until the room was perfectly, terrifyingly still. The resident of room 4B. Patient. Elias Thorne. Date of admission. October 14th. Condition: acute auditory displacement and spatial anxiety. Diagnosis: the patient has spent the last 3 weeks suffering from a persistent auditory hallucination originating from his apartment in the city center. It began as a faint, rhythmic sound, a muffled giggle that seemed to bleed through the plaster of the walls. At first, Elias assumed it was the neighbors, but eventually, he realized the apartment next door had been vacant for years. The laughter was not constant. It arrived in waves, growing louder and more frequent until it became an invasive presence. It didn't sound like a human laugh so much as a collection of syllables being gathered from different rooms and stitched together by a voice that hadn't quite mastered the art of breathing. By the second week, the laughter began to change its texture. It was no longer just a sound. It felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. He would sit in his living room, the silence heavy around him, and hear that distinct, bubbling mirth leaking from behind the wallpaper of the hallway. It sounded as though something was trying to push through the surface of the wall, hungry for the air on the other side. One evening, during a period of particularly heavy rainfall, the laughter reached a fever pitch. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore. It seemed to be vibrating in the floorboards beneath his feet. Elias stood in the center of the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, and whispered to the empty air, "Who is there?" The response was instantaneous. The laughter stopped dead, replaced by a wet, sliding sound, as if something heavy were being dragged across velvet. Then, from the corner of the ceiling, it appeared. At first, it looked like a crumpled heap of discarded laundry, a mass of dull, copper-colored skin folded into itself in a tight knot. It was crouched against the molding, barely larger than a dinner plate. As Elias watched, paralyzed, the form began to unfold. It didn't just stand up, it expanded as if being remembered into shape by an invisible hand. The copper skin smoothed out, stretching over a frame that lacked a traditional skeleton. Instead of joints, it had soft, undulating ridges that rippled like water. As the entity grew, its physical details became clearer. It didn't have a face in the way we understand it. Rather, it had a wide, horizontal slit across its front that pulsed with a pale amber light. Its limbs were thick and segmented, resembling the legs of a beetle, but covered in a soft, suede-like fuzz. When it fully extended, it stood nearly 7 feet tall, swaying slightly as if trying to balance in a world it hadn't quite mastered yet. It didn't have hands, but rather 3 wide, flat paddles at the end of each arm that moved with a graceful, sweeping motion. The entity didn't walk. It flowed toward him, its body flattening and stretching like taffy. Every time it moved, it emitted that same bubbling laughter, but now he could hear where it came from, a hollow cavity deep within its chest. Elias felt the air grow thick with the scent of old parchment and ozone. The entity stopped 3 feet from his face. It didn't have a mouth to speak, yet a voice vibrated through its copper skin, resonating directly in Elias's mind. "I was folded for so long," it hummed. Its paddle-like hands reached out, and the tips brushed against his cheeks. They were cool, almost like smooth river stones. It began to unfold again, this time in reverse, shrinking back toward its crumpled state, but with every inch it lost, its laughter became more frantic, more desperate. It was as if it were trying to squeeze itself into a memory. Finally, the entity collapsed into a perfect, shimmering sphere of copper skin on the floor. The laughter died out completely, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. Elias realized then that the entity wasn't just visiting, it was waiting for the wall to finish its job of holding it in place. He sat on the floor for an hour, watching the sphere. It didn't move, but as he prepared to close his eyes, he noticed something about the wall where it had first appeared. A small, perfectly circular hole had opened in the plaster, right at eye level. He realized then that the laughter hadn't been coming from a neighbor or a ghost. It was the sound of the entity trying to find a way out. The apartment was no longer vacant. It was merely occupied by something that wasn't finished unfolding yet. The patient is advised to remain in the hospital for at least another month, as his bedroom door must be kept firmly shut. If he hears the laughter again, he should not look toward the wall, for once the entity finds a gap large enough, it will stop being remembered and start becoming real. The Tenant of the Tide. We were supposed to be a trio, 3 friends seeking the solitude of the coast. But by the time the tide turned, we were just 2. I remember looking at Elias as he stood on the edge of the sea stack, his hair whipped into a frenzy by the salt wind. He looked perfectly content, even though the water was beginning to swallow the base of our rocky island. "I think I'll stay here for a bit," he had said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the surf. "The air feels heavier here than back at the cottage." We laughed and told him to be careful not to get swept away, but he just nodded with that peculiar, serene expression of his. Then, as the first wave surged upward, hitting the jagged stone halfway up the stack, Elias didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, and then, quite suddenly, He simply vanished into the spray. We scrambled back toward our own ledge, hearts hammering against our ribs, certain that the ocean had claimed him in a sudden gulp of foam. I turned to my best friend, Sarah, who was shivering with adrenaline. "He's gone," she whispered, her breath hitching. We both agreed. We watched the white water churn where he had stood, certain his body was resting somewhere beneath the surface. We sat in silence for 10 minutes, watching the horizon turn a bruised shade of purple, until my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was the group chat. A new message from Elias. "The salt is beautiful." I blinked, looking at the empty space where he should have been. He wasn't swimming. He hadn't been swept away. He was still standing there, but we couldn't see him because of the mist. Or so I thought. The next buzz came a minute later. "I can hear you breathing." Sarah looked at me, her brow furrowing. "He's still here?" she asked. I pointed toward the center of the stack. There was no Elias, only a distortion in the air. It looked like a ripple in a pond, a heat shimmer that hung suspended in the space where he had been last seen. It wasn't a solid body, it was a wavering, translucent bloom of warmth that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. It didn't have limbs or a face yet, just a shimmering pocket of atmosphere that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, the third message appeared. "The texture is perfect." The shimmer began to move. It didn't walk, it flowed toward us like spilled honey, expanding as it traveled. As it reached Sarah, she gasped and threw her hands up. The heat shimmer didn't just pass her, it surged forward and wrapped around her right wrist. It wasn't a solid grip, but a velvet pressure, a localized fever that felt like being hugged by a warm summer afternoon. She watched in awe as the shimmer began to solidify into something more tangible. Tiny golden grains, like pulverized amber, began to crystallize on its surface. It grew a torso, then shoulders, and finally a head that looked remarkably like Elias's, though it was slightly too wide for his neck. The most unsettling part was the face. It wasn't just a copy of his, it was wearing his skin like a well-tailored coat. His features were there, the slight crook of his nose, the way his mouth turned up at the corner, but they felt slightly exaggerated, as if someone had pressed their thumb into soft clay to perfect the shape. The shimmer began to pulse, a rhythmic thrumming that made the very stones beneath our feet vibrate. "It's hungry," I whispered. The entity took another step toward me. It moved with a strange, gliding grace, its lower half blurring into the mist while its upper half remained sharp and defined. It reached out with a hand that was now more solid than liquid. It didn't have long fingers. Instead, it had blunt, rounded digits that felt like smooth river stones. As it reached for my shoulder, I realized why it hadn't spoken in person. It wasn't just mimicking Elias. It was consuming the memory of him to build itself a body. The heat shimmer pulsed one last time, turning from amber to a deep, sunset orange. It wrapped its arms around me, and for a second, I felt his. Warmth, not just temperature, but the distinct sensation of his personality. Then, the shimmer flared with a brilliant intensity, and the entity's face shifted. The Elias face didn't change into something else. It simply became more perfect, more permanent. It pulled me toward its center, and for a moment, I felt my own warmth being tugged into its shimmering core, as if it were drinking my heat to fuel its own existence. Finally, the shimmer settled. The movement stopped. The entity stood before us, no longer a ripple but a solid, glowing figure with Elias's face fixed in a look of permanent, satisfied recognition. It leaned forward, and I felt its amber-grained hand rest on my chest. It didn't speak this time. It just hummed a single note that vibrated through my bones. The tide began to recede, leaving the stack silent once more. I looked at its face, that perfect Elias face, and realized it wasn't blinking. It was waiting for the next thing to move into its warmth. The lag of the self. The rain does not just fall in the dementia wing, it presses against the glass like a physical weight, turning the hallway into a tunnel of muted watercolors. I am one of the night observers, tasked with recording the slow dissolution of the residents. It is my job to notice what they lose, the names of their children, the taste of tea, the sharp edges of memory, and document the remaining fragments. Tonight, however, the storm has brought a strange, rhythmic ticking into the ward. It isn't coming from the clocks on the wall. It is coming from me. It began in the east corridor, where the air smells of lavender and old linen. I was watching Mrs. Gable, who had forgotten how to sit still for 3 minutes at a time. As I watched her, I noticed my own hand resting against the mahogany railing. I moved my thumb upward, a deliberate, slow gesture. My reflection in the polished brass trim followed, but there was a microscopic delay, a stutter in reality. It took nearly a heartbeat for my reflected thumb to reach the same height as the original. I stopped moving and felt a prickle of unease at the base of my neck. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the fatigue of the long shift. But as I walked toward the communal lounge, the lag became more pronounced. When I blinked, the reflection in the window didn't close its eyes until I had already reopened mine. It was a ghost of an action, a lingering echo. By midnight, the delay grew to a full second. Every time I spoke, my voice felt like it arrived at my own ears slightly after my lips finished forming the words. The strangest sensation, however, was the way my name began to feel in my mouth. Usually, Elias is a solid, sturdy word, a home for my identity. But tonight, as I whispered it to myself while checking the pulse of a sleeping patient, the syllables felt heavy and alien. It was as if my mouth were trying to shape a word that hadn't quite landed yet. When I said Elias, the sound felt like it belonged to someone else, a guest arriving in a room I had already occupied. By 2 a.m., the storm reached its peak. Thunder shook the floorboards, and the lights flickered with a sickly yellow hue. That was when I saw it clearly in the great floor-to-ceiling glass of the atrium. I stood perfectly still, yet my reflection was still moving. It had just finished a yawn that I hadn't started yet. It wasn't a mere copy, it was a pursuit. My reflection possessed a subtle, unsettling anatomy. Its skin looked like hammered copper, slightly textured and warm-toned rather than smooth. Instead of hair, its head was crowned with dense, velvet-like moss that shifted from deep forest green to gold as it moved. It didn't have traditional eyes. Instead, 2 glowing, amber spheres sat recessed in its face, radiating a soft warmth. I realized then that the reflection was gaining ground. Every time I moved, it followed with increasing speed, narrowing the gap between us. If I raised my arm, it would lift its copper-skinned limb a moment later, but it seemed to be mimicking my posture with more intensity. It wasn't just copying me, it was savoring me. I entered the lounge and sat in a velvet chair. I watched my reflection in the darkened window opposite me. It took its time. When I leaned back, it stayed upright for 3 seconds before finally collapsing into the phantom chair. The amber spheres pulsed. It looked hungry. It was as if the entity were devouring my movements, storing them in a reservoir of potential energy. Then came the moment of synchronization. I stood up and turned to face the glass directly. For a long minute, we were out of alignment. I was standing tall while it was still crouching. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, it surged forward. It didn't just move, it caught up. The copper skin rippled as it reached for me. The delay vanished. For one glorious, terrifying second, we were perfectly in sync. My hand touched the glass exactly as its mossy head leaned toward mine. We were unified. But as I pulled my hand back, the reflection didn't retreat. It stayed there, pressed against the surface of the glass, its amber spheres wide with a silent, shimmering joy. The room went silent as the rain tapered off into a drizzle. I breathed out, feeling the weight of the shift in my chest. The name Elias finally settled in my mouth, feeling solid again for the first time since the storm began. But then I noticed the most unsettling change of all. I looked back at the glass. My reflection was no longer mimicking me. It stood there independently, its mossy hair swaying in a breeze that wasn't blowing in the room. It took a step forward into my space, not as an image on the surface, but as a presence in the air. It reached out and touched my cheek with a hand of hammered copper. It didn't wait for me to move first anymore. It was deciding what to do next. I realized then that the reflection wasn't just following me, it was replacing me, one heartbeat at a time. The geometry of the hallway. Please take a seat and try to relax. I know the fluorescent lights hum at a frequency that can be irritating, but we need you to be as present as possible for this intake. My name is Dr. Eris, and today we are going to map your recent experience in the backcountry. We'll start with the basics. Tell me about the morning you left the city. I remember you mentioned a craving for silence, something that pushed you toward those high-altitude pine forests far from any paved road. You packed light, mostly because you wanted to feel the weight of the wilderness against your own skin. By the third day, however, the silence began to change, didn't it? It stopped feeling like an absence of noise and started feeling like a presence of something waiting. Describe the moment you found the clearing. Most hikers would see a grove of trees, but you described a perfect circle of white stones that seemed to have fallen from the sky rather than been placed by hand. That is where you found it, the mirror. It wasn't hanging on a wall or propped against a tree. It was simply suspended in midair, a vertical pane of silver glass about 6 feet tall. At first, it was unremarkable. You saw your own face, framed by pine needles and the orange hue of the setting sun. But as the shadows lengthened, the reflection began to disagree with the surroundings. When you looked into that pane of glass, you weren't seeing the forest behind you. You were seeing a room. It was a wide, velvet-carpeted study filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive stone fireplace that breathed out a steady stream of pale smoke. You had never lived in this house. It didn't exist in your memories or your dreams. Yet, as you stared at it, the reflection felt more tangible than the dirt beneath your boots. Then came the shifting. The room in the mirror began to stretch. The fireplace grew taller, and the bookshelves seemed to multiply, adding rows of leather-bound spines that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. You reached out a hand, expecting to touch glass, but your fingers sank into the surface as if it were heavy water. When you pulled them back, they were wet with a thin, iridescent oil. That was when the inhabitant appeared. It didn't walk into the room. It simply occurred within it. It was a doorway-shaped absence, a vertical slit in the air where the hallway simply forgot to keep going. Imagine a crack in a porcelain vase, but instead of white space behind the clay, there is a shimmering, deep violet void. It had no face and no limbs, just a jagged, irregular perimeter that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was an exit that led nowhere, a piece of elsewhere, stitched into the fabric of the room you saw in the mirror. As it moved toward you, the velvet carpet rippled. You felt a sudden, sharp tug on your chest, as if the room were trying to inhale you. The air around you began to smell of old parchment and burnt cinnamon, scents that belonged to the mirror room, not the woods. Then, the perspective flipped. The reflection started to spill out into the real world. A small section of the velvet carpet bled onto the grass at your feet. One of the bookshelves emerged from the glass like a growing crystal, its spines clicking as they expanded. You realized then that the mirror wasn't just showing you a room, it was a leak in reality. The doorway-shaped absence began to widen, and with it came a sound, a rhythmic, wet thrumming, like a giant heart beating inside a hollow cavern. It wasn't coming from your ears, it was coming from the mirror itself. You felt the ground tilt. The pine trees around you started to lean inward, as if they were trying to peer into the glass. Then, the entity, the void doorway, began to reach out. It didn't have a hand to grab you, but its jagged edges began to nibble at the edges of your shadow. You felt your own reflection begin to move independently of your body. Your mirror self stood up in the room, its face twisting into an expression of profound hunger. It reached out and grabbed the edge of the stone fireplace, pulling it toward the surface of the glass. With a sound like a heavy curtain falling, the wall between worlds buckled. The room began to pour into the forest, drowning the pine needles in velvet and smoke. You took a step forward, your boots sinking into the carpet that was now merging with the dirt. The entity pulsed once, twice, and then lunged. It didn't grab you. It simply enveloped your shoulder, the violet void swallowing your skin and turning it into something smooth and slightly shimmering. You felt the forest falling away, replaced by the weight of the stone walls and the endless rows of books. You were no longer just looking at a room. You were being woven into its architecture. Now, back in the clinic, I want to ask you one final thing. When you looked into that mirror one last time before it stabilized, what did your reflection do with the chair you were sitting on? It didn't just stay there. It reached out and pulled my own chair into the room, and now, every time I sit down, I feel a slight tug from a house I have never visited. The receipt of the unspoken room. Log 1. The clock struck 3 a.m. I am trapped in elevator B, suspended exactly halfway between the 4th and 5th floors. It is a tomb of brushed steel and humming silence. There are no other passengers, yet the air feels crowded. My breath plumes in front of my face, small white clouds that vanish as soon as they form. The emergency light casts a jaundiced hue over the buttons, which glow like dying embers. I can hear a rhythmic sound, not from the machinery, but from the floor just above us. It is a soft, domestic scraping, followed by a low hum of satisfaction. It sounds as though someone is moving furniture in a room that should be empty. Log 2. The humming has changed into a deliberate friction. It is the sound of fabric dragging over wood. I pressed my ear against the doors and heard it clearly now. Is the blanket straight, little one? A woman's voice spoke. It was warm, melodic, and slightly muffled by the heavy metal barrier. Then came a response, not a word, but a soft, contented sigh from something that isn't quite human. I realized then that although this is a hospital for healing the living, there is a room on the 5th floor that belongs to no patient. It is the room of the unseen. Log 3. A thin sliver of light appeared at the seam of the doors. Something was pushing through from above. At first, I thought it was a hand, but as it emerged, my heart seized. It wasn't flesh, it was a ribbon of white paper unspooling from the ceiling like a waterfall of silk. It had a texture like heavy cardstock and was covered in tiny, cramped script. The ribbon didn't just hang, it moved with intent. It began to grow downward, lengthening by an inch every few seconds as if it were being fed from an invisible printer in the heavens. Log 4. As the paper grew, a shape began to manifest on its surface. It wasn't a flat drawing. The texture of the paper buckled and folded into 3 dimensions. A head appeared first, a rounded crown of ruffled parchment with 2 dots for eyes that weren't holes, but raised bumps of ink. Then came the torso. The ribbon widened, creating a broad chest covered in miniature cursive letters describing different scents: lavender, rain on hot stone, old books. It was a body made entirely of information. Log 5. The entity reached the floor and began to move with a strange, fluttering grace. It didn't have joints, it simply flowed. It looked like a long, elegant gown that had decided to walk on its own. One end of the ribbon anchored itself to the wall, while the rest draped over a chair. Then it moved toward the center of the floor and began to fold itself into the shape of a small, crouched figure. "Sleep well," it whispered, its voice sounding like paper rubbing against paper. Log 6. I felt my pulse quicken. The elevator groaned as if reacting to the creature's presence. I watched as the entity, the mother, began to move toward a bed that shouldn't have been there. In the cramped space of our stalled lift, a wooden frame appeared out of nothingness. It was a simple cot with a white linen sheet. The mother reached out with a limb made of undulating ribbon and gripped the edge of the blanket. Log 7. Tuck it in tight, she murmured to herself. She leaned over the bed. Because she was made of paper, her movements were slightly jerky, like a stop-motion animation. As she pulled the blanket over the empty space where a child should be, the ink on her body shifted. The words lavender and rain blurred and reformed into new words: safety, warmth, home. She smoothed the fabric with a flourish of her paper palm. Log 8. A strange sensation washed over me. The air in the elevator grew warmer, smelling faintly of toasted vanilla and ink. I realized that the mother wasn't just tucking in a physical bed, she was tucking in a memory. Every time she smoothed a wrinkle in the linen, a new inch of her body unspooled from her shoulders. She became longer, her tail end curling around the base of the cot like a sprawling scroll. Log 9. The elevator suddenly lurched. A massive vibration shook us both. The mother froze. Her paper head tilted slightly to the left. For a moment, the ink on her face shimmered, and I saw her features change from a serene smile into a look of profound, lingering focus. She wasn't just looking at the bed, she was listening to something beneath it. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice cracking like a dry page turning in a book. Log 10. The elevator gave one final, violent jolt, and the doors began to slide open. Light flooded in from the hallway of the 5th floor. The mother stood up, her long ribbon body swaying. She looked at me for a fraction of a second, a face made of perfect calligraphy, and then she stepped out into the hall, her tail trailing behind her like a discarded receipt. I watched as she reached down and touched the edge of the bed one last time before vanishing into the shadows. The doors fully opened, revealing a perfectly empty room with a single, neatly made bed in the center, yet the silence was heavy with the weight of someone who had just been there. The Marginalia of the Last Jest. I found the book tucked into the back of the university library, wedged between a dusty tome on geology and a heavy volume of poetry. It was an old journal, its leather spine cracked and weary, but what caught my eye weren't the pages themselves, it was the margins. Someone had spent years annotating every single line in a frantic, cramped cursive that seemed to vibrate with urgency. The first few pages were merely observations on nature until I reached the section describing the Great Avalanche of 1924. That was when the handwriting shifted from observation to narration. I sat in a corner alcove, the smell of old paper grounding me as I read about the mountain pass that had been swallowed by the sudden wall of snow. The narrator described a village trapped on the high ridge, cut off from the world for 3 months. It was here that they encountered the tide, not a tide of water, but a tide of presence. The first day it arrived, the margin read, it was just a sound. A ripple in the silence. As I moved my thumb along the edge of the paper, I felt a sudden shift in the library's atmosphere. The hum of the radiator seemed to dim, and the air grew heavy, as if gravity had suddenly increased by a fraction. Then I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It was a rhythmic, bubbling trill that sounded like silver marbles falling into a deep well. I froze. There was no one in the alcove but me. I looked back at the text. The tide is a thief of sequence. It gives you the punchline before you have heard the setup, and it leaves you with the echo long after the room is empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. I realized the narrator hadn't been describing a physical tide, but a chronological one. The laugh had arrived perfectly, just as I hit that sentence. It was a joyful, wheezing sound, the sound of something recognizing itself in my own mind. I turned the page, and the handwriting became thicker, darker, as if the writer's pulse had been racing. It doesn't just visit, the margin whispered. It waits for the silence to be deep enough to swallow. At that moment, I heard a second laugh. This one was deeper, more resonant, coming from directly behind my left shoulder. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my spine. I didn't turn around immediately. I was afraid of what might be there. The library felt cavernous now, the shadows stretching toward me like reaching arms. I finally spun my chair. There was nothing there but a stack of chairs and a flickering overhead light. Yet, the laugh lingered in the air, vibrating against my eardrums like a fading chord on a cello. It didn't vanish. It simply became a hum that sat in the corner of the room, refusing to dissipate. I turned back to the book, my hands trembling slightly. The final entry was at the bottom of the last page. The handwriting was so dense it nearly bled off the paper. It has taken the tide out, the writer had noted in a shaky, jagged script. The water has receded from the shore of our reality. There is nothing left to fill the basin but the lingering echo of what was funny. As I read those words, the library lights flickered and died with a collective pop. In the sudden darkness, the laugh returned, not as a sound, but as a sensation. It felt like a mouth opening wide just inches from my face, though I could see no lips. The sound was no longer bubbling, it was sharp and expectant. I realized then that the tide hadn't just receded once, it had moved out forever. The joke of our existence had been delivered, and we were now living in the eternal aftermath. I reached out to touch the page one last time, but my hand felt heavy, as if submerged in invisible syrup. From the darkness beyond the book, the laugh spoke again, not a sound this time, but a direct thought into my brain. It was the punchline that had been missing from the margins all along. You are the one who is being watched. I felt a sudden, icy draft on my cheek, as if something had just exhaled against my skin. I looked down at the bookend, saw a new line of ink appearing in real time, wet and shimmering. It wasn't written by the original owner anymore. It was being formed by an unseen hand, trailing into the white space of the page. The ink spelled out, and you are finally ready to hear it. I felt a presence move from behind my shoulder to sit beside me on the chair. I couldn't see its shape, but I could feel its weight, a heavy, invisible mass that shifted slightly as if leaning in to listen to my breath. The silence of the library was no longer empty. It was crowded with the ghost of a joke that had finally found its audience. I sat perfectly still, terrified to move and break the perfection of the moment. Just as I prepared to close the book, the laugh happened one last time, a soft, satisfied sigh of completion. Then, in the absolute stillness, I heard a tiny, wet click from the empty air right beside my ear, like a tongue clicking against a roof of a mouth that wasn't there. The resonance of the woolen coat. Redacted was tasked with a simple maintenance check on Water Tower 09. The heat wave had been relentless, turning the air into a thick, humid soup that smelled of baked asphalt and stagnant river water. I climbed the rusted iron ladder at midnight, seeking the solitude of the summit. There, perched on the wooden platform surrounding the main tank, sat a heavy oak coat rack. It was an oddity for such a high vantage point, a relic of some forgotten owner. On that rack hung a single, oversized wool coat. It wasn't my coat. It didn't belong to the groundskeeper. It was a deep, bruised plum color with buttons made of smooth sea glass. As I stood before it, the silence of the night felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums until it became almost tactile. Then I heard it, a faint, high-frequency whine. It sounded like a radio tuned between stations, a vibrating thread of sound that seemed to originate from the very fabric of the coat. I reached out to touch the wool, and as my fingers brushed the sleeve, the whine sharpened into a needle-like pitch. The air began to shimmer around the rack. I took a step back, but the coat didn't sway. It seemed to lean toward me, as if gravity had shifted just for its sake. That was when I noticed the first physical anomaly. The hem of the coat wasn't touching the floor. Instead, it hovered exactly 3 inches above the wood, vibrating so rapidly that the fabric blurred into a hazy violet mist. Redacted tried to speak, but the sound was swallowed by the growing hum. "Is someone there?" I whispered, though my voice felt thin against the rising noise. The whine responded instantly. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was becoming a shape. From the collar of the coat, a series of translucent ripples began to bleed outward. They looked like rings in a pond, but they were made of pure vibration. As the pitch climbed higher, the texture of the wool began to change, turning from soft fiber into something resembling hammered copper. Then came the mouth. It didn't appear on a face, it manifested directly in the center of the coat's chest, blooming like a flower made of glass and electricity. It was a jagged, wide aperture lined with teeth that looked like shards of frozen light. The whine folded into this opening, spiraling inward as if the sound were being swallowed by the anatomy of the garment. Every time the pitch leaped an octave, the mouth widened, stretching the wool until it groaned. I felt a strange pressure in my own chest, a sympathetic vibration that made my ribs ache. The coat was no longer just hanging, it was pulsing. It began to move with a rhythmic, tidal heave. With every inhalation of sound, the sleeves extended like reaching limbs, not with joints or elbows, but by undulating waves of frequency. They swept across the platform, brushing against my skin with a sensation that felt like 1,000 tiny needles dancing on my pores. "Don't move," I told myself, though my legs felt heavy as lead. The whine was now so loud it was a physical weight, a screaming wall of white noise that turned the humid night into a vacuum of color. The coat began to expand, its plum hue deepening until it looked almost black. The mouth on its chest opened so wide that it threatened to split the fabric entirely. It wasn't just making a sound, it was consuming the silence of the rooftop. I watched as a bead of moisture, not water, but a shimmering liquid light leaked from the corner of the coat's mouth. It hit the wooden floor and didn't splash, it hummed. The rack began to tremble violently. I realized then that the coat wasn't waiting for someone to wear it. It was waiting for something to listen to it. The whine reached a crescendo, a piercing, crystalline shriek that felt like it could shatter glass. At that moment, the mouth of the coat snapped shut with a sound like a heavy door closing in an empty cathedral. The vibration vanished instantly, leaving a vacuum so profound I could hear my own heartbeat thumping against my ribs. The coat slumped, its fabric, returning to soft wool and its sleeves falling limp. It was just a piece of clothing again, resting on a wooden rack under a summer moon. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled the coat toward me. I expected it to be warm from the friction of its movement, but it was ice cold. As I lifted it off the rack, the weight of it surprised me. It felt heavier than any garment should, as if it were filled with crushed stones. I held it against my chest for a second before realizing something terrifying. The wine hadn't truly disappeared. It had just moved inside the fabric. I looked down at the coat in my arms and saw the mouth had reappeared, though smaller now, nestled near the collar. It wasn't screaming anymore. It was humming a low, contented note that resonated through my own bones. I realized then that the coat wasn't an object. It was a container for something that had finished its exhale. I turned to head back down the ladder, but as I reached the first step, I felt a slight tug from the sleeve. It wasn't the wind. The coat gave a tiny, microscopic jerk toward my shoulder, and in the sudden silence of the rooftop, I heard the faint, wet sound of something inside the wool settling into place, waiting for its next turn to speak. The Unbending Passenger. The hum of the train has died, replaced by a silence so heavy it feels like a weight against your eardrums. You are trapped in carriage 4, suspended in the velvet throat of the mountain tunnel. Above, the ceiling is a jagged ribcage of stone. Below, the floorboards vibrate with the faint, dying pulse of the engine's heartbeat. The electric lights flickered out 10 minutes ago, plunging the cabin into a bruised purple gloom where shadows stretch and lean like weary travelers. You sit huddled in your seat, your breath forming tiny clouds of mist that dance in the dimness. Across from you sits an old man, his face a map of deep-set wrinkles and silver stubble. He wears a heavy wool coat that smells faintly of cedar and rain. Every few seconds, he looks toward an empty chair to his left, a simple wooden seat with a frayed velvet cushion, and offers it a small, deliberate wave of his hand. "Good evening," he whispers, his voice like the rustle of old parchment. You find yourself watching that empty chair, expecting something to appear in the vacuum of its space. Then you hear it, a soft, metallic click from the luggage rack above your heads. It sounds like a hook hitting wood. You look up and notice a cluster of coat hangers hanging there, their wooden shoulders smooth and curved. They aren't moving much, but as the train gives a sudden, violent lurch forward, one hanger swings toward the empty chair. The old man waves again, his eyes crinkling. "She is waiting for her turn," he says softly. You look at the chair, then back at him, confused by his words since there is nothing but air and dust resting on the velvet. A low moan echoes from deeper in the tunnel, and the temperature drops. The frost begins to crawl across the windows in intricate, fern-like patterns. Suddenly, a soft rustle comes from the luggage rack. One of the coat hangers, a heavy, cedarwood piece with a hooked neck, doesn't just swing, it leans forward as if bowing. It is no longer perfectly curved. The hook at the top has straightened by an inch, pointing toward the empty chair like a beckoning finger. You feel a prickle of unease crawl up your spine. "It happens every time we stop," the old man says, his voice steady despite the gloom. He waves at the chair again. A second hanger slides along the rack, its wooden body unbending, straightening its curve until it mimics the shape of a slumped shoulder. Then comes a third. Each movement is accompanied by a rhythmic clack-creak sound. The silence of the tunnel feels different now. It isn't empty. It is expectant. You notice that as the hangers straighten, they begin to slide off their hooks, one by one, falling into the air toward the empty chair. They don't fall straight down. They drift like feathers, rotating slowly in the stagnant air. As each hanger lands on the velvet cushion, it settles into a different position. One becomes a hump of wood, another forms a jagged peak. The old man's smile remains fixed, but his eyes are wide, tracking the descent of these wooden travelers. You realize that they aren't just landing, they are accumulating. They are filling the void of the empty chair with their own geometry. "They like to be straight," the old man murmurs. A strange sensation washes over you, a feeling of being watched by something without a face. The hangers begin to move again, but this time they don't need gravity. From the rack, more hangers are unbending themselves, their wooden spines snapping into straight lines with the sound of breaking twigs. They start to migrate, sliding along the ceiling beams like insects, seeking the chair. You find yourself holding your breath, watching a hanger near the door straighten until it is perfectly linear, then drop into the chair, perfectly upright. The old man waves one last time, his hand trembling slightly. "Almost ready," he says. The train gives a final, shuddering groan and comes to a complete halt. The silence that follows is absolute. Then, you hear a sound you didn't expect, the sound of wood sliding against velvet. You look at the empty chair. It is no longer empty. A dozen hangers have piled onto it, unbending themselves until they are perfectly flat, overlapping like a deck of cards. But as you watch, the very top hanger, the one that had been the most crooked, begins to vibrate. It doesn't just sit there, it pushes against the others. Slowly, with a deliberate, grinding motion, it begins to unbend its hook, stretching out until it is no longer a curve, but a straight line pointing directly at your chest. The old man leans forward, his face inches from yours in the dark. "It wants to see if you are made of wood, too," he whispers. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in the air, as if the hanger were reaching out toward you. Then, with a final snap, the hanger fully straightens, its hooked end pointing like a needle at your heart. The old man reaches out and touches the tip of the wooden hook, his fingers cool as ice. "It has finished," he says, and for the first time since the lights went out, he closes his eyes. You sit in the darkness, the train perfectly still, watching that single straight line of wood. Just as you prepare to speak, you feel a tiny movement from the chair. The hanger didn't just point at you. It began to pull itself forward, the tip of the hook sinking into your chest like a needle into fabric, drawing you into its wooden grip. The commuter's companion. The fluorescent lights of the subterranean parking garage hummed with a low, electric anxiety. I pulled my sedan into level 4, the concrete pillars casting long, geometric shadows across the oil-stained floor. It was nearly midnight, and the silence was heavy enough to feel like weight against my eardrums. I stepped out, the air smelling of damp limestone and old rubber, and locked my car with a sharp click. As I began walking toward the elevator, I noticed something peculiar about the spacing of the cars. To my left, 3 spaces down, sat a rusted hatchback. It was perfectly centered in its bay. I remember driving past that same spot on the way in. At the time, that space had been empty. A small frown creased my brow as I continued toward the concrete stairs. Then came the first true shift. Every time I blinked or turned my head just a fraction of an inch, the hatchback seemed to migrate. When I looked straight ahead, it was 3 spaces away. When I blinked again, it was 2. It didn't roll. It simply inhabited a new position with seamless fluidity. I stopped in my tracks. "Are you moving?" I whispered to the empty air. The car remained still. I took a step forward, then another, and looked back. It was now just 1 space away from me. My heart gave a dull thud against my ribs. I began to walk faster, my footsteps echoing like rhythmic hammers. Every time my eyes drifted to the side, the hatchback crept closer, closing the gap with every heartbeat of my attention. By the time I reached the base of the stairs, it was directly beside my shoulder. It wasn't just a car anymore. It felt like a looming presence. And then, there were others. Small marks began to appear on the concrete, not tire tracks, but tiny, jagged indentations, as if something had been dragging its weight across the floor while I wasn't looking. I climbed the stairs to the mezzanine level, seeking clarity. Here, the shadows were deeper. I saw a tall, vertical shape standing near a pillar. It was the entity that lived in the periphery of my vision. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a smooth, iridescent sphere of copper-colored skin, pulsing with internal veins like a pomegranate. Instead of legs, it possessed a series of overlapping, fan-like plates that shifted like the scales of a fish. It was standing perfectly still, tucked into the corner of Pillar 12. But as soon as I turned my head to find it, it lurched forward. It moved with a frantic, jittery grace, its copper head spinning 360 degrees. The moment I fixed my gaze on it, it snapped back to Pillar 12, shrinking into the shadow as if trying to hide from my observation. "Don't look at me," it seemed to say, though no voice emerged. I realized then that the 2 nights were beginning to blur. I couldn't remember if I had just parked or if I had been standing here for an hour. The hatchback was now a dull bronze color in my memory, and the copper-headed creature felt like it had always been part of the architecture. I reached the middle landing. The creature was halfway between pillars now, its plates vibrating with a soft hum. It moved again as I blinked, a sudden, violent lurch that made the air whistle. It was closer now, only 3 feet away. Its copper head was pulsing faster, the veins glowing with a faint amber light. I tried to run toward the exit, but my legs felt heavy, as if the gravity of the garage were pulling me toward the creature. Every time I blinked, it gained ground. Blink, it was at the base of the stairs. Blink, it was reaching for my waist. Blink, it was inches from my face. It moved with such purpose that I felt a draft of cold air against my skin. It wasn't just moving, it was pursuing me during the intervals of my own consciousness. I stopped running and stood perfectly still, holding my breath, trying to keep my eyes wide open for as long as possible. Finally, I gathered my courage and forced myself to stare directly at it without blinking. The creature froze. Its copper sphere became perfectly smooth, reflecting the overhead lights like a polished planet. It didn't have eyes, yet it felt as though it were perceiving every cell of my body. Its fan-like plates stopped vibrating and flattened against its body. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the heavy steel door that led to the street. The creature stayed in its frozen pose for 3 long seconds. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the cool surface of its copper head. It felt like warm porcelain. Then, with a sound like a soft exhale, it finally moved, not toward me, but away. It didn't just slide, it vanished into the shadows behind the pillar in one fluid motion. I pushed through the door and into the cool night air of the outside world. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, my chest heaving. The garage was behind me, its hum fading into the distance. I looked down at my hand, the one that had touched the creature's head. It was still tingling with warmth. I turned back to look at the entrance of the garage one last time, expecting to see it standing there in the light. But as the door swung shut, I saw a flash of copper color in the darkness, not on the floor, but hanging from the ceiling directly above my head, waiting for me to close my eyes again. The Echo at mile marker 42. 1 minute and 12 seconds. The road is a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the silence of the valley. It is late, and my headlights are carving out small pockets of visibility in an ocean of ink. I am tired. My coffee has gone cold, and the hum of the engine feels like a lullaby for a journey that refuses to end. 14 minutes and 45 seconds. I see the sign ahead. A highway rest stop. It is isolated, a lonely island of gravel and asphalt surrounded by towering pines. I pull over, the tires crunching against the grit. The silence here is heavy, weighted with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. 16 minutes and 20 seconds. I step out of the car. The air is crisp enough to make my breath hitch in my chest. In the center of the rest stop stands a single vending machine. It is an old model, painted a peeling forest green, with a neon light that flickers with a rhythmic, wet clicking sound. 18 minutes and 30 seconds. I pull out my phone and check the group chat we started years ago. We called it the Inner Circle. It was meant for our 4 best friends from college. Now, 3 of them are gone. The last one, Leo, died just last month. But the chat is still active. 19 minutes and 45 seconds, a notification pings. I expect a memory or a joke, but instead, it is a text from Sarah. She died 2 years ago in that hiking accident. Is it getting cold where you are? She asks. My heart skips. It was impossible for her to text back. 21 minutes and 10 seconds, I look up at the vending machine. The flicker of its light seems to pulse in time with my heartbeat. A second ping sounds. This one is from Marcus, who passed away 5 years ago. The lights are beautiful tonight, he writes. There is no wind, no breeze, just the stillness of the pines and the steady blink of the green machine. 23 minutes and 55 seconds. I walk toward the machine to grab a soda, but the silence is broken by a sound. A footfall. It comes from behind me, a soft, muffled thud on the gravel. I turn my head, but see nothing but the shadows of the trees. I take a step forward. Thump. Then, a second later, thump thump. 25 minutes and 15 seconds. The sound is deliberate. It mimics my pace perfectly, but it adds an extra beat. Every time I move, something else moves with me, creating a rhythmic triplet of sound. 1 step for me, 2 for the thing behind me. 27 minutes and 40 seconds, I stop. The footsteps stop, though they feel like they are lingering just a fraction of a second longer than mine. I can't see it yet. It is hidden in the periphery, blending into the gloom of the trees. I reach out to touch the glass of the vending machine. 29 minutes and 10 seconds, my phone vibrates again. The group chat explodes with activity. Sarah, don't look back too quickly. Marcus, it likes the rhythm. Leo, can you hear us? I freeze. My thumb hovers over the screen as a new notification appears from my own name in the chat, even though I haven't typed anything yet. 31 minutes and 20 seconds. The text from me reads, "It is standing right behind your left shoulder." 32 minutes and 45 seconds. I hold my breath. The air feels heavier now, charged with a static electricity that makes the hair on my arms stand up. I can feel a slight pressure against the back of my neck, like a warm puff of air exhaled against my skin. 34 minutes. The footsteps begin again as I start to walk toward the car. Step, 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 step. It is moving with me now, its gait slightly more hurried than mine. The ground beneath its feet seems to groan ever so slightly under a weight that isn't entirely physical. 36 minutes and 15 seconds. I reach the driver's side door and grab the handle. Just as my fingers wrap around the metal, the footsteps stop. Not just behind me, they are directly in front of me. 37 minutes and 50 seconds, I look up. The entity is finally revealed. It isn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It is a towering, elongated shape made of what looks like woven velvet and polished copper wire. It has no face, only a wide, smooth expanse of bronze skin where I should be, and its limbs move with a fluid, liquid grace. 39 minutes and 20 seconds. It doesn't have fingers. It has 3 segments of jointed metal for each digit, clicking like a clock as it moves. It leans forward, its bronze face hovering inches from mine. 41 minutes and 5 seconds. The group chat gives one final notification. Sarah, it wants to take your turn. Leo, the circle is closing. Marcus, wait for the click. 42 minutes and 30 seconds. A sharp, metallic click echoes from the entity's head. It opens its mouth, a simple horizontal slit that glows with a soft amber light. 44 minutes. I feel a sudden, violent pull, as if my entire body is being drawn toward that glowing slit. The world blurs into a smear of green vending machine light and dark pine shadows. 46 minutes and 15 seconds. Suddenly, the tension snaps. The entity recoils and melts backward into the shadows, its bronze face settling into a serene expression. The footsteps vanish. 48 minutes. I am alone again. The silence of the rest stop returns, profound and heavy. I scramble into the car and slam the door shut. 50 minutes and 30 seconds. I start the engine, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I look at the group chat one last time. There is a new message from the entity, a contact that wasn't there before. It reads, "Thank you for the rhythm." 52 minutes and 10 seconds. I put the car in gear and begin to drive, but as I look into the rearview mirror, I see something tucked into the back seat. There, sitting perfectly still, is a single copper wire, glowing with a faint amber light. It wasn't there when I got out of the car. The loose skin of the rich. Welcome to your first shift at the archive. Before you step into the vault, take this locker room briefing to heart. Trust your senses, but never assume a familiar shape is a permanent resident. Last winter, we had a team trapped in the ridge for 72 hours during the Great Freeze. They spent their time huddled in a snow cave, a cramped, crystalline ribcage of ice that smelled of wet wool and old breath. There were 3 of them, Elias, his mother Martha, and their golden retriever, Barnaby. For years, Barnaby had been Martha's shadow. He was the dog who would lean his heavy weight against her shins while she knit. He was the hound who knew the exact vibration of her heartbeat. But on the 3rd night, when the wind began to howl like a grieving widow, something shifted in the cave. It started with a subtle dissonance. Martha was sitting by the small fire, her hands numbed by the cold, while Barnaby lay at her feet. Usually, The dog would be resting his chin on her knee, but he suddenly stood up and retreated to the furthest corner of the ice wall. He didn't just move, he recoiled, his ears pinning back as if she were a sudden noise in a quiet room. When Martha reached out to stroke his fur, Barnaby let out a low, confused whimper and ducked his head. It was the first crack in their lifelong bond. By the second day of the storm, the atmospheric pressure inside the cave felt heavy, as if the air itself were thickening with moisture. Martha noticed that Barnaby no longer recognized her scent. He would weave through her legs, then suddenly freeze and bark at her throat, his tail twitching in agitation. It was as if the dog were looking at a masterpiece he had once owned but now couldn't quite place. Martha tried to compensate by humming her favorite tunes, but Barnaby remained restless. He spent more time watching the shadows on the ceiling than he did watching her face. On the third night, the true horror manifested. The snow cave was silent, save for the rhythmic drip of melting frost. Elias woke up in the middle of the night to find Martha sitting perfectly still against the icy wall. Barnaby was standing directly in front of her, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at something just above her shoulder. Then, the dog let out a sharp, frantic yelp and began to pace in a tight circle around her, his paws clicking against the frozen floor. Martha spoke softly into the dark. "Is someone there, Barnaby?" she whispered. The dog stopped pacing. He sat down, but instead of leaning toward her, he let out a mournful howl that sounded more like a question than a cry. Then, he did something that made Elias's heart seize. He turned his back on her entirely and walked to the opposite side of the cave, tucking his tail between his legs as if trying to hide from her very presence. It was then that Martha realized the dog wasn't just reacting to a new sound, he was reacting to a new inhabitant. In the center of the cave stood something she hadn't noticed before. It looked like her, in a sense. It had her height and her general proportions, but it moved with a fluid, slightly offbeat grace. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it possessed a surface of smooth, honey-colored skin that seemed to ripple like water. Most unsettling was its size. It wore a body that fit it just one size too loosely. The skin hung over its joints like a heavy velvet cloak, creating soft folds at the elbows and knees. It didn't have hair or fur, but rather a texture like a sun-warmed peach. The entity moved toward Martha with a slow, deliberate gait. As it approached, Martha realized why Barnaby was so confused. The entity carried her mother's exact scent, the smell of lavender soap and old books, but it lacked the nuance of her soul. It moved like a puppet wearing its puppeteer's clothes, struggling slightly with the excess material of its own skin. When it reached Martha, it didn't speak. It simply reached out a hand that was slightly too long for its wrist and touched her cheek. The dog let out one final, high-pitched whine. He recognized the scent perfectly, but he could see the imperfection in the form. To Barnaby, his mistress had been replaced by a ghost wearing her clothes, a beautiful imitation that lacked her spark. The entity leaned in closer, its loose skin bunching up around its neck as it tried to mimic Martha's smile. It was a perfect physical translation of her mother, but it was hollow. The storm finally broke on the fourth morning, revealing a pristine white world outside the cave. When the sun hit the ice, they saw the entity clearly for what it was, a visitor that had stolen a life to wear as its own. Martha stood up and took the dog's collar in her hand. Barnaby pressed his wet nose into her palm, finally recognizing her again, even if she was now sharing her identity with a stranger. The entity didn't leave when they did. It simply settled into a corner of the cave, content to occupy the space Martha had vacated. As they stepped out into the biting air, the dog walked closely by Martha's side, his tail wagging in rhythm with her steps. They left the cave behind, but as Elias looked back one last time before they climbed the ridge, he saw the entity move. It didn't just sit there. It reached out a hand and tried to catch a snowflake, its loose skin fluttering like a flag in a gentle breeze. The dog now sleeps at her feet every night, but whenever he closes his eyes, he still flinches slightly when she moves too fast. He knows that somewhere in the ridge, there is a creature with his mother's scent and her shape, still trying to figure out how to inhabit the skin it stole. The architecture of the drift. I moved to the last house on a road the maps forgot because I wanted a silence that didn't have an echo. It sat at the terminus of a winding dirt path where the forest grew so thick it seemed to lean inward, pressing against the shingles like spectators waiting for a play to begin. The first night was simple. I walked through the front door into a foyer of polished oak and took 3 steps toward the kitchen. When I turned back, the hallway was gone. In its place stood a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves. This was the house's first update. It rearranged itself while my eyes were averted. By the 3rd day, the rules became clear. The house didn't just move. It traded spaces like a deck of cards being shuffled by an invisible hand. If I stepped into the dining room and closed the door, the moment the latch clicked, the room would swap with another. I would open the door again to find myself in a sunroom filled with ferns or a drafty attic with a single velvet chair. It was a rhythmic, shifting geometry. I began to map it mentally, learning that every time I blinked or moved between chambers, the layout updated. On the 7th day, the spill arrived. It didn't have a face or a body in the traditional sense. It was a pool of viscous, ink-colored liquid that behaved with defiance against gravity. Instead of pooling on the floor, the spill clung to the walls like heavy rain falling toward the ceiling. It moved in slow, rhythmic pulses, thick and gooey, leaving shimmering trails behind as it climbed upward. It didn't just sit there, it rippled. When it hit a corner, it would gather into a heavy bulb of darkness before flowing along the seam like honey sliding down a vertical pane of glass. I first noticed it in the bedroom, the room that had moved to the west wing during the night. It was creeping up from the baseboards, moving with a wet, sucking sound. Every time the house swapped rooms, the spill migrated. If my current room swapped with a distant one, the spill would lurch across the invisible bridge of transition, reappearing on the new walls and beginning its upward trek again. "How far do you go?" I whispered to the dark as it crested over the crown molding. The house replied by swapping the bedroom for a narrow corridor where the floor was made of smooth river stones. By the 2nd week, the spill was becoming more aggressive. It wasn't just climbing, it was accumulating. Each time a room swapped, the spill gathered more mass from the atmosphere, growing thicker and heavier. It began to weave into patterns on the walls, forming strange, undulating textures that looked like topographical maps of a world made of shadows. The house felt smaller as the rooms became crowded with this rising tide of ink. I found myself spending less time walking and more time watching it climb. One evening, I was in what had become my favorite room, a cozy parlor with a hearth. I closed the door to sit by the fire, and the house shifted instantly into a vast, hollow hall. The spill was already there, but it was different now. It had climbed so high that it covered the upper half of the walls entirely. It moved like a slow-motion wave, rolling over itself in heavy folds. "Stay still," I told myself, though my voice felt swallowed by the density of the room. Then came the night of the Great Compression. The house began to swap rooms at a frantic pace. Every few seconds, a new chamber would replace the old one, a pantry, then a gallery, then a nursery, then a cellar. The spill reacted violently to these rapid updates. It surged across the walls like a tidal wave of molasses, seeking the highest point. Because it moved upward against gravity, it began to stack upon itself, creating thick, hanging curtains of dark liquid that brushed against my shoulders as I stood in the center of the chaos. I realized then that the spill wasn't just decoration, it was the house's memory. Every room the house had ever held was being stored within that climbing ink. As the rooms swapped faster and faster, the spill began to leak downward from the ceiling, heavy droplets of dark liquid falling like slow-motion rain into my hair. Finally, the shifting stopped. The house settled into one final configuration. It was a perfectly circular room with no windows and no doors, only a single archway I had just passed through. The walls were nearly submerged in the spill, which now sat 3 feet deep from the ceiling down. It was thick enough to feel like velvet. I stood in the center of the circle, the only dry spot left. I reached out a hand and touched the wall. The spill didn't just sit there, it pulsed. It felt like a heartbeat muffled by heavy fabric. It began to move again, but this time it wasn't climbing upward. It was moving inward toward me. I watched as the dark liquid surged from the walls, flowing toward the center of the room in a slow, inevitable tide. It gathered at my feet and began to rise, swallowing my boots, then my knees, then my waist. I didn't move. There was nowhere left to go because the house had finally finished its updates. As the spill reached my chin, it grew silent. The movement slowed until the ink was barely rippling, suspended in a state of perfect, heavy tension. Then, from the very center of the mass, something began to press against the surface of the dark liquid. A small, distinct protrusion emerged, not a hand or a face, but a sharp, pointed peak that pushed outward like a mountain top breaking through the clouds. I held my breath as the peak grew, stretching the ink thin until it was almost translucent. Just as the spill reached my lips, the surface broke with a soft, wet pop and a single, smooth protrusion poked out into the air to taste me. The patient of the windless deck. Patient 0, the ferry passenger. Subject observed during a gale on the crossing from Oakhaven to Solace. I am recording these notes as the lead night nurse, though my hands shake enough that the ink occasionally smears. The ferry is nearly empty tonight, save for us, the staff, and the few travelers who prefer the solitude of the storm. We are currently on the observation deck. It is a strange irony. Outside, the gale is screaming, whipping the salt spray into a frantic mist, yet here on the wood-planked deck, the air feels eerily still. That was the first anomaly. The wind should be rattling the railings and buffeting our hair, but it seems to be bypassing the deck entirely as if the storm were holding its breath just for us. Then, there were the chimes. Hanging from the central mast are 12 glass tubes, each unique in shape. Normally, they dance wildly in a breeze, but tonight, they remain motionless. They hang perfectly vertical. And yet, they began to ring. At first, it was a single note, a high, crystalline chime that vibrated through the floorboards. Then another followed, and another. They were ringing in a rhythmic sequence. 3 sharp notes, a pause, then 2 soft ones. It wasn't the wind doing this. There was no gust to trigger them. The chimes were being struck by something invisible. I sat on a bench, clutching my clipboard, watching the glass tubes tremble. I felt a prickle of heat on the back of my neck. I looked toward the railing and saw it, a shimmer in the air like heat rising from asphalt. It wasn't a solid shape yet, but a distortion. Then, the name occurred. I hadn't spoken a word aloud yet, but just as I opened my mouth to whisper, "Who is there?" a voice resonated from the center of the deck. It was a hollow, melodic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Marrow," it whispered. I froze. I hadn't called its name yet. The entity had anticipated my thought by exactly 1 beat. From the shimmer, the creature solidified. It was not a ghost of light or shadow, but a mass of texture. It possessed a body made of overlapping scales that looked like hammered copper, each one etched with tiny, swirling grooves. Instead of a face with a nose and mouth, it had a singular, wide aperture in the center of its head, a horizontal slit that pulsed like a gill. From this slit sprouted hundreds of thin, hair-like filaments that drifted upward as if submerged in water, even though we were in open air. It moved with a strange, jerky gait, its copper scales clinking softly against one another. "Marrow." I finally breathed out, my voice trembling. Before the sound could leave my teeth, the creature responded again. "Marrow," it hummed back, this time with a slight vibrato. It moved toward me, its filaments swaying in the direction of my body. It didn't walk so much as glide, its copper scales catching the dim lantern light. I realized then that it wasn't just reacting to my voice, it was feeding on the intent of my voice. It lived in the split second before the sound reached the air. I stood up, trying not to let my knees buckle. The chimes began to ring again, faster now, a frantic staccato that mirrored my heartbeat. Each time I thought of a question, the creature provided the answer a fraction of a second before it could form into a word. "Are you hungry?" I thought. "Hungry." The copper thing replied instantly, its horizontal slit widening. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. It wasn't just a creature, it was an echo of the future. It was a thief of moments. As it drew closer, I could hear the sound of its scales rubbing together, a dry, metallic rasp like coins being shaken in a silk bag. It reached out with one of its primary filaments. It wasn't a hand, but a long, whip-like strand that ended in a small, bulbous knob. It touched my cheek. The surface was cool and felt like wet velvet. As it touched me, the chimes went silent. All 12 tubes stopped at once. In that silence, the creature's slit opened wide. A low, thrumming vibration began to emanate from its body, shaking the very floorboards beneath my feet. It was a sound of deep contentment, or perhaps of preparation. I realized then why it had been waiting for me to call it. It didn't want to be found. It wanted to be recognized. I took a deep breath and prepared to speak again, to ask the final question that would define its presence in this storm. "What do you want?" I asked aloud. Before the what could fully settle in my mind, the creature's copper scales began to turn inward, folding over themselves like a closing flower. Its filaments pulled back toward its center, and the horizontal slit glowed with a faint, internal amber light. "Mine," it replied, just as I began to form the word. It didn't wait for me to finish. The creature lunged forward, not with teeth or claws, but by simply merging its copper body into my own chest. For a moment, I felt a sensation of immense weight, as if a heavy stone had been placed inside my ribs. Then the weight vanished. The creature was gone from the deck. It was no longer an observer, it was a resident. I stood alone in the center of the observation deck as the storm finally broke, the wind returning with a vengeance to shake the ferry. The glass chimes began to dance wildly again, clattering against one another in a chaotic symphony of silver and crystal. I looked down at my own chest, where the copper scales had left a faint, metallic indentation on my skin. I realized then that the creature wasn't just inside me, it was beginning to pulse with my own breath. And as I stood there in the spray, I felt something move beneath my ribs, not a heart, but a tiny, copper scale clicking against another, waiting for the next thing I would think of before I even dared to say it. The deepest frequency. I am the last man left at the signal house, and my task is to translate a manuscript that refuses to let me reach its final period. The paper feels heavy, almost damp, as if it were soaked in brine before the ink was even dry. It tells the story of the Great Siege, but while the soldiers fought on land, I sit here in the telegraph office, listening to the pulse of the ocean. My duty is simple: receive the clicks from the fleet and translate them into the language of men. But for the last 3 nights, the pulses have changed. They are no longer steady rhythms of here or safe. They are erratic, desperate bursts that seem to come from a depth greater than any map can define. I sit in my wooden chair, my ears ringing with the constant metallic snap of the telegraph key. The room is small, lit by a single flickering oil lamp that casts long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Outside, the sea is a vast, churning void, but inside, the silence between the clicks feels heavy. It started on the 4th night. A shift occurred in the atmosphere of the office. There was no sound at first, only a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that turned my breath into tiny puffs of mist. Then came the smell, not of salt or fish, but of old wet copper and crushed violets, a scent so thick it felt like a physical weight against my skin. I checked the logs, expecting a change in the weather, but the horizon remained flat. The clicks continued, steady as a heartbeat, until they suddenly stopped altogether. For 1 full minute, there was no sound from the wires outside. Then, a new pulse began. It wasn't a mechanical click. It felt like a rhythmic thrumming coming from deep beneath the waves, a vibration that made my teeth ache. I dipped my pen into the ink to record the sensation, but as I moved, the copper violet scent intensified, becoming pungent and sharp. The temperature plummeted further until frost began to bloom in delicate patterns along the edges of my desk. It felt as though the air itself was being squeezed by an invisible hand. Then, something changed from a mere atmosphere into a presence. It wasn't just a cold room anymore. It was a space occupied by a weight that didn't have a shape yet. I could feel it hovering near the ceiling, a vastness that felt both massive and intimate. When I finally looked up, I saw the first physical manifestation. A ribbon of iridescent, translucent membrane drifted past my lamp. It wasn't skin or hair, but something like woven silk dipped in oil, shimmering with colors that don't exist in the daylight, a bruised plum, a pale mint, and a strange, metallic gold. It moved with the fluid grace of a jellyfish, swaying through the air without touching anything. I held my breath, my pen hovering over the page. "Is it you?" I whispered to the empty room. The response was not a voice, but a ripple in the air that caused the papers on my desk to dance, as if caught in a sudden underwater current. The scent of copper became overwhelming, like a handful of coins tossed into a bucket of crushed flowers. Then came the texture. From the corner of the room, something began to emerge from the shadow, a cluster of soft, velvet-like protrusions that looked like the underside of a mushroom, but felt as smooth as polished marble. They were not limbs, so much as extensions of its being, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction. These velvet growths reached out toward me, seeking contact. I watched them move, fascinated and terrified by their lack of joints. They didn't sweep, they flowed. One of these protrusions touched my shoulder, and it felt like a thumb pressed against a warm stone, yet it was perfectly smooth. The entity began to reveal more of its form. It wasn't a body in the traditional sense. It was a sprawling arrangement of those velvet folds, interconnected by glowing veins that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. It had no face, no eyes to judge my fear, but it possessed a shimmering crown of crystalline shards that rattled like wind chimes whenever it moved. The most unsettling part was its scale. As it expanded, the room felt smaller, as if the very walls were being pushed inward by its sheer existence. I realized then that it wasn't just in the room with me. It was reacting to my presence in the room. Every time I blinked, it shifted a fraction of an inch closer. The telegraph began to click again, but the sound was different now. It was mimicking the pulse of the entity's veins. It was as if the ocean and the creature were speaking through the wire, and I was merely the bridge between them. The manuscript on my lap felt lighter, its ink beginning to swirl as if it were trying to flow off the page to meet the velvet folds. "You have noticed me," I said, my voice trembling in the sudden chill. The entity responded by expanding one of its largest velvet folds until it hovered just inches from my face. It didn't have a mouth, yet the smell of copper violets became so intense that it felt like a taste on my tongue. It was an ancient thing, something that had lived in the crushing pressure of the abyss for eons, now pulled upward by the sheer curiosity of being observed. I realized that it hadn't come to the surface because it was hungry. It had come because I had started listening to the deep. The silence returned, heavier than before, and the entity began to recede, pulling its velvet folds back into the shadows of the ceiling. It didn't disappear. It simply settled into the rafters like a sleeping giant made of silk and marble. The telegraph gave one final, solitary click, a definitive end to the transmission. I picked up my pen to write the final word of the manuscript, but as I did, the velvet fold nearest to me twitched, reaching down just enough to brush against the paper. I finally understood that it wasn't leaving because it was finished. It was waiting for me to finish so it could claim what remained of the silence. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.